Think about the last time you reached out to a business you were really interested in working with. Maybe you filled out a contact form, sent an email, or dropped a message through a website or social media. Something that actually required effort on your part because you were serious enough to send it. And then you waited. Maybe you heard back the same day. Maybe you heard back 3 days later with an apology. Or maybe you never heard back at all. What's worth noticing about that experience is that by the time the response arrived, no matter when it was, something had already happened. A judgment had already been formed. Not consciously or a decision to thought through yourself, but a sense of what working with this business might be like from the silence between your message and their reply. That judgment, formed before a single exchange, is what this video is all about. When considering first impressions, most businesses focus on typical points. How to present yourself, how your website looks, or how confidently you can communicate in a first meeting. But what most completely miss out on is where the first impression actually forms. It doesn't form in the meeting. It forms in the gap between when someone reaches out and when you respond, in the quality and speed of that first reply, and whether the experience of initial contact feels organized and intentional or chaotic and reactive. By the time you're sitting across from a potential client, literally or virtually, they've already made a preliminary judgment about you, one that colors everything that follows, one that your polished pitch is either working with or against, depending on what happened before you got there. At its most fundamental level, a first impression in a business context is the answer a potential client's brain gives to a question it asks automatically and unconsciously, the moment they make contact. Is this a reliable operation? Not is this person talented, not is this service high quality, and not is this a fair price. Those come later. But the first question, the one that gets answered before any of that, is simply whether the experience of reaching out felt like reaching out to something solid and trustworthy, or something uncertain and disorganized. And the primary input for that judgment is response. How quickly, how clearly, how professionally, and whether it happened at all. There's a concept in cognitive psychology called the primacy effect that I think explains the response problem better than any business framework that I've come across. The primacy effect, which is documented across decades of memory and impression formation research, describes the disproportionate influence of early information on overall judgment. Simply put, the first things we learn about something or someone carry more weight in forming our overall impression than information that arrives later. The most well-known early research comes from Solomon Asch in the 1940s. He showed that when people are given a list of personality traits describing a stranger, such as in the order of intelligent, industrious, impulsive, critical, stubborn, and envious, they form a significantly more positive impression than when the exact same traits are presented in the reverse order of envious, stubborn, critical, impulsive, industrious, and intelligent. The traits are identical, with the order as the only variable. The order alone changes everything. What the primacy effect tells us is that the brain doesn't process information neutrally and then form a judgment at the end. It forms a preliminary judgment early, often at the very first piece of information, and then uses subsequent information to confirm or adjust that judgment. But the adjustment is always partial. The initial impression has disproportionate sticking power regardless of whatever comes after. In the context of a business inquiry, that means something very specific and very practical. The experience of making the initial contact with your business, the speed and quality of the first response, forms an impression that all subsequent interactions are filtered through. A slow or disorganized initial response doesn't just create a neutral delay. It presents a negative preliminary judgment that your eventual proposal, expertise, and work ethic all have to overcome retroactively. And retroactive impression correction is significantly harder than getting the first impression right. I learned this the hard way in the early days of RA-Works. I was doing everything manually, responding to inquiries when I had time, following up when I remembered, and managing the whole thing through a combination of email notifications and good intentions. What I didn't fully realize was that by the time I got to the actual conversation with a potential client, the conversation I'd spent energy preparing for, Some of those conversations were already compromised. The delayed response had already answered the question they were unconsciously asking. Is this a reliable operation? And the answer my response time had given them was not entirely. What's worth understanding about the slow response problem is that it's almost never about not caring. Most small business owners who respond slowly to inquiries are not indifferent to potential clients. They're simply busy. They're doing the actual work. They're managing everything themselves across multiple priorities simultaneously. The inquiry notification came in while they were in the middle of something, and by the time they got to it hours later, it felt awkward to respond without acknowledging the delay. The intent is fine. The operational reality is the problem, because the potential client on the other side of that silence doesn't have access to your operational reality. They have access to only one thing: the experience of reaching out and waiting. And through the primacy effect, that experience is actively forming a judgment about what it will be like to work with you. There's research from lead response studies, including work published in the Harvard Business Review, showing that the odds of successfully contacting a lead drop by over 10 times if the response comes after the first hour, compared to within the first 5 minutes. And the odds of qualifying that lead drop by 6 times. The research was conducted across industries and consistently produced the same finding. Speed of response is one of the strongest predictors of whether an initial inquiry converts to an actual client relationship, more predictive than the quality of the eventual response in many cases. Think about what that means. A mediocre response sent within 5 minutes outperforms an excellent response sent 3 hours later. Not because the mediocre response was better, because the primacy effect has already done its work by the time the excellent response arrives. The first impression was formed in the gap. Everything after is just an adjustment. For most small businesses without teams, this isn't a battle you can manually win consistently. Not across every inquiry, every platform, every time zone, every day of the week. The operational reality of running everything yourself means that some inquiries will inevitably arrive at moments when you cannot respond immediately. And no amount of good intentions fixes this structural problem. When thinking about the best way to solve a structural problem, there's no better one than a structural solution. Not better habits, not more diligent notification checking, and not a reminder system that relies on you remembering to act on it. Those are behavioral solutions to an operational problem. And behavioral solutions often fail under heavy workloads, which is exactly when you need them the most. The honest question worth sitting with is what your first response is actually communicating right now. Not what you intended to communicate. What the experience of receiving it actually tells someone about the operation behind it. Because the primacy effect doesn't evaluate your intentions, it evaluates the experience. A response that arrives immediately, regardless of where you are and what time it is, communicates something specific about how your operation is structured. That someone thought carefully enough about this moment to ensure that it never falls through the gap between a notification and a free moment. A response that arrives when you get around to it communicates something equally specific, however talented the person is sending it. The solution to the primacy effect problem isn't trying harder to respond faster. It's building something that ensures the right impression happens structurally rather than depending on your availability in any given moment. That used to require a personal standby, but nowadays it doesn't. So back to that business that you reached out to, the one where you filled out a form or sent a message and then waited. Think about what happened in that silence. You weren't just waiting for information. Your brain was answering your question, forming a judgment that would color everything that came afterwards, deciding, before a single conversation happened, what kind of operation this was and whether it could be trusted with something that mattered to you. That judgment wasn't fair necessarily. It didn't account for how talented the people behind the business were, how much they cared, or how exceptional the work would have been if the relationship had gotten that far. But it was real. And it was sticky in a way that first impressions always are. The businesses that understand this don't just work on being good at what they do. They work on what happens before the conversation even starts. You can be the most talented person in your market, But if the experience of reaching out to you feels like reaching into silence, you'll never even get the chance to prove it. The conversation starts before you even know it, so make sure your answer to the first question is the right one.